Ah! Go that way. Go that way. 行ってください。あそこにいて。何それAloha, welcome to this week's video. So this is a piece of that epoxy koa that I made previously, just some leftover. I've been trying to think of what I wanted to do with it, and I finally came to a decision. I'm going to be using half of it, a little bit less than half, but about half of it for nunchucks. So I've been asked, a ton of times. It's probably the single most asked thing I get is to make some nunchucks. And I haven't really, nunchucks are awesome. I haven't been overly interested in making them because at the end of the day, they're, just two sticks and some string. So I've kind of been hesitant. I've been thinking about, different designs and ideas this whole time, but I've never really thought of a good path. But as I was looking at this material, I thought, this material would make for some really good nunchucks. One thing you can see here, though, is I'm looking at the material, and right there. So you see how it broke? The majority of the material, the connection between the epoxy and the wood is more lengthways. There was a couple sections where it was more perpendicular, and that was one of them. And so I was really nervous with those perpendicular sections, but it was just that one section there, and I was going to be cutting it off anyway, so it worked out. I'm not strength testing them at the moment. I might be doing that later, but right now I just want to start working on them. I'm actually not going to shape them yet. I debated on how I wanted to connect the nunchucks together with either chain or cordage. I decided to use cordage, and doing a little bit of research, it looks like the majority of nunchucks are made using paracord, which makes sense. It's just a good material for that use case. And so while researching, and yes, I did some research on nunchucks, it looked like how they're generally built is the paracord goes through the center of the wood there, and then it's partially hollowed out and has a centerpiece that it ties onto, and so that's what I'm marking in here. And so I'm going to be drilling in first like starter holes in all of the locations, and the whole purpose of that is really just to give me a good guide so that all my holes are perfectly in line. I'm not going to be shaping it until I'm done with this part, primarily because I figured it'd be a lot easier to drill these while it was still more of a square shape versus trying to drill it while it was, after it's been shaped and either cylindrical or whatever shape I decide to put into it. I just figured it'd be easier to do this section here. So those are the starter holes, and now I'm going to be going all the way through. I'm trying to be very careful and very precise. I don't want the bit to walk on me at all, and it actually worked out pretty good. I ended up getting those pretty straight, and so that top section there connects into that top vertical section, connects into the top horizontal section, and that's where the paracord goes through. And then these two holes that are horizontal, I'm going to be taking out wood in between to make a section that will wrap. And looking at other nunchucks, that's how they're doing it. I think they primarily do it just so that the paracord or cordage is almost like an inlay, so it doesn't stick out. I don't know if that's the only reason. That's just kind of what it looked like to me. And so for this first one, I just scored it, and I'm using my chisel to cut it out. Those holes that I drilled were 5/8 inch, which I happen to have a 5/8 inch chisel, so that worked out perfect. And so my plan was I was actually just going to take it down with this on all of those sections. That way I'd have really clean edges and it'd look really nice. But then when I flipped it over and I started working on this side, it scored perfect. But as soon as I started using my chisel, I noticed that the epoxy was just not cutting well. It just wasn't good. It was a little bit hard, a little bit brittle. I wasn't really liking it. So I decided to get my Dremel and cut it in with my Dremel. I used a thinner bit at first, and it really wasn't giving me kind of the results that I wanted. I mean, it was working, it just was messy, and I didn't really like it. And so I swapped it out with this larger tungsten carbide bit, and this worked perfect. In fact, it worked so well that I decided to go back on the other side and finish that side off, make it a little bit deeper, and then using just the bit, I cut in the other section as well. And it worked great. So rather than scoring it, now I'm just marking it so that I can make sure that I'm in bounds, and then just using this bit to clean it out. And as you can see, it just worked perfect. I mean, that's probably saved me a good hour, maybe 2 hours on chisel work, using that to bring in those grooves. Now there's one more thing that I want to do on this before I can start shaping, and it's something I've been thinking about for a really long time. So I'm going to be inlaying shark teeth. These are tiger shark teeth into the handle of the nunchuck, so the striking section. But I don't want it just to be an inlay. I want it to be like a floating tooth. And so I'm going to drill out an entire section, fill it with clear epoxy, and have the tooth kind of floating in the center of the epoxy. I have to be really careful when I drill this out because I've got really tight tolerances between the edges. I'm a little bit nervous that the integrity, the strength of it's going to be a little bit lower, but at the same time, the epoxy should bind really well to both the epoxy that's in there as well as the wood. So I'm not too worried. We'll find out when I go to test it. So here's the two holes, the sections that I drilled out. I'm going to go ahead and tape up both the sections with just painter's tape. And then I have painter's tape here on the table. The purpose of that is just I'm trying to keep it held in, and then I'm using my liquid glass epoxy. This is a very, very, very slow setting epoxy. It takes like a full week for it to set completely, but about 3 days for it to start to become a lot more rigid. After about 24 hours, it's usually gummy, but it's still a little bit cold here, so it's going to take a little bit longer for it to set, especially since there's not very much of it. So the epoxy's thermal reaction, it takes heat, and so since I've got such a small amount of epoxy, it's just going to take a while for it to actually cure. It is a 2-part, and so it's 2 to 1. I guess that would be a 3-part, so it's 2 to 1. And so what I'm doing here is just mixing it. You have to mix it for a good 15 minutes. You really want to make sure this type of epoxy is mixed well, and then I let it sit, and then I use the heat gun to heat it up just a little bit as well as pop any bubbles. So now that it looks to be almost completely bubble free, I'm going to go ahead and pour in, but I'm only going to pour in about 50% into those holes. And so I'm going to let this sit now for, I think it was about 2.5 days. And now after 2.5 days, it got to a state where it was just thick enough that the teeth won't sink in. So if I put the teeth in right away, the epoxy is way too thin. It's way too liquidy. It would just, the teeth would sink right to the bottom. And so now it's quite a bit thicker. It's very viscous now, and I'm able to set the teeth in place. All I did here is I just wrapped some painter's tape, made like a double-sided tape, stuck it to the tooth, and then pushed that tooth into the epoxy, and then the epoxy grabbed a hold of the tooth, so it works perfect. Same thing with the other side. That worked really well as well. So now I have those both at about halfway, and so now that those are floating at about halfway inside the epoxy, I'm going to go ahead and pour, mix another batch of epoxy and pour the rest of it into it. I did make a mistake here. You won't see it in the video, but there are some air bubbles. What I should have done is, instead of pouring the entire second pour like this, what I should have done is just poured a little bit at a time. I think there were some air bubbles that were trapped underneath the shark tooth, and they started to rise up, and some of them got trapped inside of the epoxy. So that was kind of unfortunate. They're mostly clear, so I kind of messed up that pour just a little bit. but it's okay. It's primarily a personal piece, so I'm not too worried about it. If this was for a customer, I'd probably start over on the epoxy. I'd probably try to drill it out and re-pour it, which would be a huge waste of time. Probably an entire week worth of wasted time, because it's about 2.5, 3 days for the first half. It's going to be about 2.5, 3 days for the second half, and then a final probably day and a half to get it to the point where I feel comfortable working with it, where it's not going to be squishy. So it'd be a huge waste of time if I got it wrong again. So now I'm just going to let it sit, and I'll be back at it here in a few days. I hope you enjoyed the video. This is part 1. I'm really excited for part 2. This is the first set of nunchucks I've ever made. I apologize if I'm making them horribly wrong. But I think the epoxy coil wood here is going to work just absolutely beautiful with making some cool looking set of nunchucks. I most likely won't sell these. I'll probably just keep them, but I'm interested to see how they test. I'm a little bit nervous. I think they're just going to snap, but we'll find out when I go to test them. Mahalo plenty for everyone that's watched my videos. If you enjoy them, please like and subscribe. Leave me a comment in the comments below. It really helps out. I really enjoy it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time. Aloha.